Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie Kabov, and my dear friend Jonathan Fremantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, partly raised in Australia, by a quirk of fate relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, predominantly love of art.
Jonathan Fremantle. I grew up in Cape Town, studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense and have been making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg where I had Hazard Gallery. And that was the context that I met Valerie. Just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. That conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation and look forward to where this goes.
We always come back to art because it is the love that loves us back. Hi, everybody. So, on this podcast today, we have a very dear old friend of mine, Simeon Nelson, and we've known each other since our Sydney days. I would like to say in the 90s. To me, the 90s don't even count because the 80s are everything. But Simeon is kind of also, in many ways, an art polymath because you're an educator, you're a public artist, and you're one of a few artists alongside with Jonathan, who has visited us in Harare, which
Yes.
has been tremendous. And one of the things that I've always known about you is your commitment to rational thought, Simeon, and also a deep interest in science and mathematics from an artistic perspective. And this is manifest both in your sort of in your practice as an artist and your approach to things. And most recently, you are an artist fellow, I guess, as part of a major scientific project. And we
That's
thought
right.
this was a great occasion to engage with the idea of the conversation between art and science, but also, I guess, some of the limitations on either side, right? And what we contribute, because I think to my mind, we often live in the world which is sort of replete with expert fallacy, where everyone feels qualified to speak to everything, and we lose the things that are unique and special to our fields by trying to encroach on other fields. And so,
Well, that's
you
part
know,
of the big paradox, isn't it? The French philosopher Michel Serres, I forget which book, it's up there. He said something like deep disciplinarity is propedeutic to the dialectical ascension. What he meant by that was that true inter or transdisciplinarity can only be done by people who've done their 10,000 hours, people who are deep disciplinarians in their own field. Otherwise, it's just flaky. It's just sort of flippity gibbets. It's just flapping around and about so much ado about nothing. I agree with that. I think the longer you're in something, the more expert, the deeper and sharper your expertise bites. There's this kind of diffuse penumbra where the edges become more and more ragged and more capable of interfacing with the ragged edges of other disciplines until something meaningful would happen in sort of interstitial zone between the two areas. I really believe that. I've always believed that. And I've always kind of sought out people who also believe that, who I can work with and who can become fellow travelers in this exciting voyage of discovery.
So tell us about your current project.
In late 2024, I got a phone call from Andrew Goodman, an old friend of mine. He's professor of inorganic chemistry at Oxford, runs a great laboratory there. He's a heavy hitter, he's all over the place doing great things. His research is cited massively across the literature if you're in the chemistry field. And I've always been interested in chemistry. He deals at the molecular to the submolecular levels. He's constantly sort of dipping in and out of the quantum realm, spending a lot of time in the quantum realm. And I've always been interested in how does one represent, without being kind of literalistic, the phenomena occurring at below the wavelength of visible light. So a few years ago, I asked him to be a physicist consultant on one of my projects, Cosmoscope, which had an astrophysicist, a biomedical physicist, and a molecular physicist, i.e. Andrew, or a chemist. I mean, where does physics end and chemistry begin? There are so many different ways of construing the boundaries between disciplines. That's part of the ragged edge. The micro, the meso, the mid scale where we're at, and the macro scale. He handled the micro scale. His research is fundamentally about looking at different types of disorder, or aperiodicity as they call it, in molecular structure, and learning how to kind of leverage that aperiodicity, how to sort of intervene, not control, but firstly understanding that intervene, the potential for creating a whole new class of supermaterials, anything from flexible transparent metal, or being able to store the entire contents of the internet in something the size of a grain of salt in the electron diffraction patterns around the atomic nuclei. There's a lot of holy grails there, which industry and government is willing to chuck a lot of money at. So he rang me up and asked if I wanted to be the sort of visiting professor, artist consultant on this project, to which he was applying to the Royal Academy in one of these new Faraday Discovery Awards, £8 million each. They only awarded 6, and there were, I think it was like over 1,000 applications in the initial round. So we're very lucky we got it. I now work a couple of days a week as a external consultant, which is quite nice because it seems to be back into academia without all the nonsense. I'm doing various things. Started running a series of workshops, making workshops, or as they're slightly grandiosely called, professorial masterclasses with all the research fellows. I mean, he usually isn't there. He's a very busy man, but he has a team of about 15 incredibly switched on research fellows, postdocs, and doctoral students who are all really up for it. And they are quite porous. They're quite willing to be impacted by a notion of artistic practice. And so the big questions are, well, the first question is, does it make any sense to even ask the question, is there the possibility of making a meaningful representation of a subatomic or atomic or submolecular quantum phenomenon at a macro scale? We know Anthony Gormley's tried this, and they're quite nice, those sort of quantum figures of his. I think they succeed to some level. So the answer is probably no, you can't. But because we're sort of stuck in the macro realm, our imaginations are deeply challenged by all the implications of what's happening in the quantum realm. It sort of boggles the mind. My capacity to imagine what's going on is very quickly, I'm just sort of left floundering on an imaginative level. And so that's the first question. And the second question is, can me working as a kind of macro or mesoscale sculptor cast aside the image of a kind of heroic figure sort of combing the marble chips out of his beard for a minute, because it's not quite like that, or, hewing a log with a giant axe with a sort of sinewy, sort of rippling torso. It's not quite cast aside that image too. Like sort of, Auguste Rodin or Julio Gonzalez or something. But can these sort of analogical ways of representing or leveraging ideas about the very, very tiny scales, at the sculpture scale, at human body scale, how could they help these chemists in their imagining and developing new visual languages for aperiodic and disordered states? Well, it must all sound just completely bonkers. I've mentioned this to a few people, and they're just looking at me like, Simeon, really? It's quite hard to. I struggle with it at times.
So what has that meant in practice?
A series of drawings. So the making workshops have just simply been each participant, each member of the lab, sending me in as condensed a possible form the most critical issue that their research is trying to illuminate, whether that's frustrated spin or all these other ideas. A lot of them work with metal organic frameworks, which are kind of alliances between organic and inorganic molecules to be able to do various magical things. On one level, it's very instrumental and all about sort of industry and enabling the kind of supremacy of quantum computing and AI. But on another level, there's something quite mysterious. And because I've always been interested in these ideas, and because they've always just naturally emerged from my subconscious or from the irrational part of me, which makes the work, it's a natural fit for me to be working in this way, even though it's quite anxiety inducing because there's serious money involved and the pressure is on to actually produce a result. And the Royal Society is very interested in this. They've never funded an artist before in their entire 350-year history.
Is your role, I'm just, as you're talking, it's fascinating to kind of try and figure out where you sit in this.
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
But I mean, it might be both the answer to both of these kind of binary polarities, but is your function to sort of look towards the scientists and help them unlock whatever it is that they're trying to unlock? Or are you, with this team behind you, facing the public and helping disseminate and explain and
Well,
visualize?
that's a really interesting question, because Andrew and I, in the funding application, we made it very explicit that we
Yeah.
were not just falling back into the traditional role of art as the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
Do the research, then bring in the artists to kind of tart it up, do an exhibition, make it public facing, and help with the public impact and dissemination. Because the way scientists imagine things in their heads, arguably there is a similar process to artistic imagination going on. There are lots of anecdotes about scientists having sort of mystical dreams and coming up with ideas for new chemical compounds, and the structure of benzene in the 19th century is the most famous example. Without sort of mentioning Jungian archetypes, there is a kind of perhaps a substratum of the unconscious and the imagination, which is actually critically important to scientific discovery and insight. And that's where, as one of my other main scientific collaborators, Simon Walker-Samuel, says, when we gave a joint presentation a couple of years back, he said, well, actually, you know what? Science is just a subset of art. It's a particular instrumentalization of the human predisposition to represent the universe, to try and symbolize what's going on and to make sense of it. And I thought, yeah, I think you're right. I think there's some truth in that. In the application for funding, and this caused a lot in the peer review. It's a very rigorous peer review thing you get, where you have to respond to the criticisms sort of endlessly over many months. And they all wanted to have more explanation as to what the role, what the hell is an artist doing in a hard-hitting, major application for scientific funding. So the point we tried to make was that, yes, of course, there's a role for artists to disseminate and to make amazing exhibitions and to engage the public with the wow factor and to introduce these ideas to interested publics of museums or whatever. But what we're trying to do is to bring the role of the imagination, the sort of mechanics of representation, because they underpin and they direct the decision of which experiment to design, for example. Science can go in many ways. It's up to this subjective decision making of the particular researcher as to what they're going to investigate. I've read enough sort of counterfactual literature that science could have gone in very different ways. We could have an extremely different science than the one we have. I mean, science seems to be at the moment in a process of transitioning from a kind of simplistic materialism to something much more capable of dealing with some of the sort of great mysteries that have been brought up in various religious traditions, for example. And I find that very exciting. So the role of the imagination, the mechanics of representation, is not just an afterthought. It's key to how the science develops and which hypotheses you test and how you interpret the test results. So we're saying that to have this explicit discourse around what it means to represent ideas and how to have a kind of reflective capacity to guide yourself in terms of how you design experiments, that can be quite useful for the scientists involved. And it could actually produce unforeseen results or possibly even better results. I think many scientists naturally do this anyway. And I'm certainly not going to be coming in sort of preaching some sort of gospel, which, that would be an exercise in disciplinary chauvinism, as if artists have the only kind of capacity to do such a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
In many ways, art and science, I mean, not to discount all the other categories of humanity that do this, but art certainly and science is engaged with a kind of exploration of the unseen, or what we don't yet know.
Yes.
There's something profound about those two worlds working in the same room.
Although I would argue that art has a greater relationship with making leaps of faith blithely into the unknown in a way that, again, like more step by step, and whereas art has that capacity because I guess it's not constrained by as many practical ramifications, right? But I was just wanting to ask Sim, do you think that also part of your role as an artist in this context is to be asking different kinds of questions? And like the way I would interpret some of the things that you've been talking about is like reasserting the centrality of humanity, or, the human element in the scientific
Yes,
process? I
definitely.
mean,
I'm just not there as like a whetstone to sharpen up the scientific knife so it can cut deeper. Not to be an alchemist, to kind of reunify the objective pursuit of science with the subjective state of the inquirer, the relationship of the observer to the observed. But I think there is an element of that. Sharpening up the scientific knife so it can cut deeper is one thing, but also drawing inferences and providing a cultural context for the activity or the ideas is also potentially useful. I mean, it could also just be a big distraction because they're very busy people, these scientists. They're paid by funding bodies to get on with it, not to kind of sit around philosophizing, if you know what I mean. So there's a slight tension there. But I certainly think there are lots and lots of human aspects to scientific inquiry. And there's a lot of analogies you can draw between scientific inquiry and artistic inquiry. And I think science can become a sort of an immensely rich, meaningful, transformative process, the actual process of discovery, that has ramifications similar to artistic inquiry that can reconfigure our sense of our place in the cosmos. If you don't have to think too hard to realize that's been a constant process of revising who we are in the face of the absolute and in the face of where sort of what our relationship is to the whole shebang. So I think if you prioritize that, if that's a real interest, then I think the science has as much to offer as the humanities and the arts in some ways. But it all depends how you think about it.
Do you find
yeah, go.
that in the kind of early stages, images starting to appear, or how does your mind kind of comprehend and process this kind of data that you're being?
It's a fusion of my own inquiry and what I'm encountering with them. So as Andrew keeps saying, Simeon, our goal is to get to a common language. And I think we've got some way to go. Here I am working away on various sort of drawings and models and things in my studio, and they're going quite well, but they're not there yet. It's going to take a little while. And getting the members of the laboratory comfortable with sort of surfing their intuitions and just producing kind of irrational objects that do have some basis in their research, but not necessarily explicitly, because in these making workshops, I say, this is making as thinking, or thinking through making. Don't worry about the ideas, just leave them in the background. They'll sort themselves out. It's just like groping in the dark with your hands and the material feedback. And that's the way to get to something which you could never have even imagined, to not be too intentional, to not be too prescriptive, to not be too illustrative. And that's a difficult thing to do. That causes some anxiety, both in me and in them, because if you're groping in the dark and someone walks in who's wondering what you're up to, it might look like you're just wasting time. Like doing some sort of slightly flaky workshop. It might look like that, but you've got to go through that. There's no avoiding it, really. We're in that stage, that very interesting stage, very delicate stage that has to be managed. It remains to be seen as to what the results are. It's a fairly high-risk project.
Well, no one's going to die, Simeon. No one's going to die. Is that the joy of you being
exactly.
the
No, the future of humanity is not directly at stake here, thank goodness. So
Thank God. I was just thinking about anarchy in the organism, the work that you did for the Cancer Institute, which feels to me like almost like an opposite process, right? Where you start out with something quite discrete and yet you generate something that is, can you talk a little bit about that work? Because I think it's kind of interesting where you're doing something similar, but something very different.
Actually, it was a full-on collaboration between myself and Simon Walker-Samuel. He's the director of the Center for Advanced Biomedical Imaging at UCL. They're sort of developing new imaging technologies to understand tumors and cancer, how cancer spreads, how to metastate. That was a real wonderful meeting of minds, because we discovered that we're both fascinated by various things like Lindenmayer systems, which is like the branching algebra that creates trees and blood vessel networks, and Voronoi representations, all that sort of stuff, which I'd been using naturally in my work. And he just couldn't believe an artist was using this stuff in their work. And so we had automatically from the get-go had a powerful shared language to work with. But I was very interested. The subtitle, it was called Anarchy in the Organism, because cancer, of course, being a form of anarchy within the sort of autopoietic, the homeostasis of the organism, it's like a sort of radical sleeper cell. It steps outside all the regulatory mechanisms and it starts to grow these bizarre blood vessel networks. It's uncontrolled cell growth. It's sort of cells lose the ability to die. It has all sorts of implications. One of the things I've always thought about cancer, it's a bit like mistletoe in a tree. Mistletoe really kills the tree, but it has a kind of parasitic or epiphytic relationship to the body. There are all sorts of analogies you can draw there, from urban planning to human intervention in the biosphere at large. I mean, that's just automatic to me. The idea was to see cancer as a complex system. So the time it was anarchy in the organism, in brackets, cancer as a complex system. So thinking about cancer as not as a disease, but as a kind of more neutrally as a response to certain triggers, or as a way of dealing with something, or it was kind of difficult because my thinking was very misunderstood by the patient representatives who were involved. And at one point, the head, Jilly Angel, the head patient representative, felt I was kind of implicitly blaming cancer victims for their cancer. Was an absolute total misunderstanding. But we quickly cleared that up. Misunderstanding was replaced with understanding. So it was trying to zoom out from the trauma of cancer and think about it more speculatively. And interestingly, my mother's twin sister was dying of cancer during this process, and the composer, Rob Goldman, his father, died of cancer during the process. So, and also my first daughter's godmother died of cancer during the process. There was a lot of death from cancer going on in our personal lives. Strange. And I interviewed various cancer sufferers in my studio after doing a sort of sensitive interviewing course, because, these are people who very soon after were no longer with us. So it was very fraught, very human, a lot of suffering involved. But I was trying to recast cancer as a natural phenomena, like at times a catastrophic phenomenon, but something that could be understood through making analogies to other phenomena in the biosphere at large, or in Earth's history, or et cetera, et cetera. And so we ended up making a series of these digital organisms that developed cancer to various degrees, and using data from the incidence of people who get precancerous, who experience cancer, whose lives are profoundly changed by cancer, those who recover and those who die. So we tried to keep those at ratios. And the algorithms basically just self-generated cancer in these organisms, which were displayed on giant screens. The algorithm was beautifully designed by Nick Rothwell, a computer scientist artist, who's the other main collaborator on the project. In the end, there was a big symposium composed of a lot of cancer medicos from UCL Hospital and the Center for Advanced Biomedical Imaging, and patient groups at the Wellcome Trust. But this a long time ago now. It's well over 10 years ago. And at the beginning of this symposium, there was a lot of accusations from the patient groups that the scientists were so divorced from their suffering that they needed to actually be present to the suffering. They needed to actually understand, or show they understood, and show some humanity. And so it was very incredibly sort of cathartic experience.
I think that sort of circles back to the idea of the importance of the artist as a catalyst for being overwhelmingly preoccupied with what it means to be human. And that is the presence that you're kind of like something of an anchor. So where no matter how far-fetched the scientific research process goes, it can take you away from the centrality of the human and the human experience and the relevance. And which is why I guess the visualization at the human scale is meaningful, not because it resembles something that actually happens, right? Is it a particle or is it a wave? Who knows? But the fact that it is still something that a human being needs to experience, that it's only meaningful to the extent that we as humans experience, because we are the observer ultimately, right? And this world only exists for us.
It's probably a good definition of the role of the artist in all these sorts of things, to kind of remind people to both step back from their area of expertise and contextualize and broaden the horizons and think about where it all connects, those ragged edges, and also to step more into the humanity and realize that what you're doing is going to have an impact, whether it's cancer research or making materials, super materials. It's all going to have a kind of an impact on the human and the more than human, the biosphere, the world we live in. So I think that's probably a good justification for resources, as you have to do in these funding applications, for why spend the money on an artist, because actually the artists are damn useful for that very reason.
I wonder if there's another dimension. You kind of said it anyway, that I don't know whether it's true or not, but that anecdote of when Columbus arrived in the New World and the people on the beach couldn't see the ships because they didn't have a word for it. They didn't have a language to describe what they were seeing, so therefore it was invisible. And, we know that that phenomenon exists across our human experience. Until we have a way to speak it, we can't see it. And there's something about the
That's
kind of
true. That's
power
one
of
thing I spend a lot of
imagination.
time explaining to students.
Yeah.
We can only think so far as our language can
Yeah.
provide a kind of a hook into the imagination. I mean, I don't entirely agree with that. I think we can imagine things we don't have yet have a word for, and perhaps that's what art
Yeah.
does. It picks things for which there's no sort of written or
Mm.
verbal language. But certainly, it's a very interesting point. The language is both a prison of thought,
Mm.
you know, subject, verb, object. I
Mhm.
do this, that sort of thing, or and language also as freeing up thought by if you have a series of gradations of descriptions of something, then you
Mm.
can think about it in a much more fine-grained way than if you just got bad or good or light or
Mm.
dark or right or wrong. And also, it's very useful in the encountering of something you know absolutely nothing about, or something that
Mhm.
seems to be very counterintuitive to the way you naturally think, something that pulls you outside your own little epistemological bubble
Mm.
and forces you to potentially radically revise your own thinking, to
Yeah.
actually completely abandon a whole lot of stuff that you took as you might have taken as fundamental or as beyond question, sort of casting aside one's assumptions.
So I've got a question. Do you believe that science can save the world and we as artists can help it do that? I mean, I often have more faith in science just as a way of solving very human world problems.
I don't know, science, I suppose the reason science has been so successful in how is it that a bunch of filthy sailors in tiny little boats managed to go to America and take over a whole civilization? We sort of know the mechanics of it. But the myth of progress is, I think, maybe the role of art is to get scientists to regress to something more primitive, more atavistic, less kind of enslaved to this notion that we're going towards a brighter, shinier, smarter, quicker, more enlightened future.
I
Art
would
is
argue
regressive.
that, but we're on a Zoom, and we have no
Yeah,
fucking clue of how it's happening. And so my view is that I don't think it's either one or the other. I honestly think we can have both. If art is integrated and humanity is central to the scientific project, then that is the validity. And I thank God every day we have internet. There's not a
Oh, of
single
course, yeah.
day
We
that is
wouldn't
a
be doing
bad day because of internet. And I challenge anyone to argue otherwise. And we don't know how it works. And it's because of science. I don't think we need to regress in order to become more human.
Well, it's interesting that recent advances in various branches of science seem to be taking us forward to the past, or the notion of panpsychism,
Mm.
the idea that a greater part of the soul is outside the human body or the brain, or the idea that the external world is animate rather than inanimate, was something that was considered to be the territory of cranks and crazy people, hippies, and sort of new age witch doctors. But a lot of certainly the scientific ideas I'm in touch with is more sort of recognition of we're sort of moving away from a hard materialism. That seems to me to take us back to a sense of nature as being fundamentally alive and valuable, and humans being embedded in a very sort of creaturely and vulnerable way. We're not the masters of creation, where in fact, all sort of Elon Musk's fantasies of going to Mars are just fantasies. I don't think it can ever happen.
Mm.
I think someone born on Mars could never return to Earth because they'd be crushed by the gravity. Or, I think what we wish for, and pretty humble in the limits to what we are creaturely.
But
We're
isn't that a,
situated in particular
but
bodies.
isn't that a materialist premise? We could have a very long conversation
Yeah,
around this. So it just depends on how you split the concept. Sure, the meat suit is less than, but the consciousness is greater than. And then the role of the observer,
mm,
right? I mean, one of the like really beautiful thing that I saw a few weeks ago is they're doing an experiment on exposing a plant, a flower, like a living flower, the pattern of light generated became de-randomized. So the flower somehow was, because it needed light, was influencing how randomly generated machine.
They have agency. They have the ability to make changes in the environment to suit them, or to interact with other species, to
Well, how
create a
much
more...
more so humans?
Well,
I think your point, though, of the sort of development of knowledge not being linear, I think it's powerful to acknowledge that it's possible that there were times in our human history where we were more connected with a kind of wisdom that we're trying to seek through these kind of frontiers of science and art. And that there is an opportunity to kind of decode back towards something that's more instinctive and holistic.
Do you find that then in this context, contemporary art that is, given the famous between the two of us, Simeon, debacle at the Hertfordshire University talk that I gave, is that
yes.
the contemporary art world is actually anachronistic in this process, being very deeply connected or committed to unscientific materialism in that sense, which, because a lot of art that I see being produced sort of by artists is broadly derivative and like committed to like going in the opposite direction of science at this point. So in a way, what I feel that what you're doing is progressive in a sense, is something that moves in a generative and constructive direction. But
Well, for some reason, a quote by Baldwin, that great black theorist, the quote is something like this: "The role of art is to uncover the questions that have been hidden by the answers." I love that.
That's so great. Yeah.
Is to kind of throw it all up for debate again, not to seek refuge in something that's sort of comfortably known and is a fait accompli, is something we don't have to question anymore. I think every generation has to ask these questions for themselves and to throw everything open for debate again. And every single generation has to do that for themselves. Otherwise, they're just the passive recipients of accumulated knowledge, which means you might have to ask questions that reference something that's happened a very long time ago, or questions that were first asked thousands of years ago that have been forgotten by progress in science or art discourse. You have to sort of go back to the source and interrogate some of the premises, perhaps. Maybe that's what good art does. It actually opens things up again. Is that progress or regress? I don't know, but it's just not being satisfied with the unconscious biases that we're born into of our culture and society.
But also asking questions differently. I think I have a feeling, because from my experience of sitting on the think tank, AI sort of related think tank, where for a year I sat thinking that I'm just floundering, not contributing any value. It turns out they thought I was contributing value the whole time just by asking questions that occurred to me from an art perspective that did not occur to other people and would not have occurred to them.
Yeah, maybe the role of the artist or someone like you is to be the child, to ask the silly questions, the basic questions.
The child, I was trying to Simeon.